Londoners have always drunk a lot of beer. In fact, in the medieval period, you might be paid in beer. You might get as much as a gallon a day. It's 4.5 litres. And the reason you drink so much is twofold. First off, the water is often not fit to drink. And secondly, ale is a really good source of cheap calories. Which sounds very bad to us today, but if you're too poor to feed yourself properly, that will give you the energy you need to get through a hard working day. It's not as alcoholic as modern beer. Most of the time it's underneath 1%, but if you drink a gallon of it, the effects are much the same. So that's what we're talking about today. The beer industry, how we get it, how we make it, where we drink it. And a really good place in London to look at the history of beer is in Southwark. So that's where we start our story.
Chapter 1. Hops. What do you think this building is? It's pretty striking, right? Blue, for a start, which is not a usual colour for buildings. A lot of ironwork on it. It's pretty massive for how close it is to the road. It sort of looms over you. You can never quite stand far back enough to get a good look at it. Have a look at the gates. They're all twiny. They've got fruit on them. Those are hops. Hops are a plant, a bit like a vine, and they're not fruit, those are the flowers. They're used to preserve and flavour beer.
This building was built in the 1860s as a hop exchange, where traders could all come and sell their goods in a single central location. Now, they don't normally let you film inside, so showing you this is a little tricky, but it has a glass roof, which means there's a lot of natural light inside this building, and that's really essential for checking the produce. Hops are grown south of London in Kent. All over this building are little red badges with white horses on, which is the symbol of Kent. And they would send hops either up by the river or on trains into London Bridge Station. There were loads of hop companies around here, partly because there are lots of pubs around here, and partly because there's a massive brewery in Southwark, which we're going to see later on. Some of them were so big that they fielded their own cricket teams. The hop exchange has cellars underneath covering nearly an acre. They were used by a company called Lyons who ran tea shops, and they would store their wine in there in these massive cellars underneath the building in these huge bins. Each bin would carry 2,000 bottles in it underneath the hop exchange. But in the 19th century, we didn't actually need a hop exchange. All the hop companies were already well established. They didn't want to move into a separate extra premises. So in fact, it never actually got used for its intended purpose. And then the Victorians never even called it the hop exchange. They called it the central building. The hop exchange is a title it's been given later to make it seem more attractive and heritagey, so that they can rent it out for functions and dinners, and they even have fashion shows there now. So hops have grown for beer, but beer isn't made from hops. They're more like a preservative and a flavouring ingredient. They make it a little bit more bitter and they make it last a bit longer. But they're not the main ingredient. About 100 litres of beer only needs about 100 grams of hops. They've been called the spice of beer. For most of our country's history, we didn't even use hops. They only came over in the 15th century from the Netherlands. So most of the time we were drinking it without hops in, and we were perfectly fine with it. And these days we grow a lot fewer hops than we used to, partly because we don't like beer as bitter as we used to, and partly because we import a lot of hops now. Working class families would go hop picking in the summer. They would all travel down to Kent and they would spend their time in the fields harvesting all the flowers. Hops grow on vines on these really tall poles. So you have to pull the pole down and then strip off all the flowers and put them in this big bin without getting any leaves in there. And they would treat it a little bit like a holiday, because of course for them it's getting out into the countryside, getting some fresh air, spending some time in the fields. But it also pays, which is really important when your main job back in London does not offer holiday pay. But of course you weren't staying in a hotel during this holiday. You would stay anywhere where the farm could fit you. And that might be a barn or a cowshed or a stable. Sometimes it might be a shack or a lean-to or a tent. And sometimes it might be on the roof with no cover at all and no bed, just sacks or straw. In the 1930s, the writer George Orwell went hop picking, and he said that you were generally on your feet about 10 hours a day, and the work was very hard. The plants have this kind of black juice in them that gets all over your hands, and they have spines which can stick into your skin. And the toilet was so filthy that he'd walk a mile to avoid it. Hygiene was sometimes incredibly poor because it's so hard to get fresh water in the middle of a field. In one farm in 1849, there was a cholera outbreak that killed 43 hop pickers. The locals hated this influx of townies. They would lock their doors and put their shop stock behind chicken wire. But he said, despite all that, the work itself was actually quite nice. You were out in the countryside, you had fresh air, except the pay was so bad. You're paid depending on how many hops you pick. So if you are sick, or if you have to stop to untangle the vines, or if you have to stop to move into the next field, you're not getting paid for that time. You can be fired for any reason, and if you are fired, your employer can keep a quarter of your pay for the whole time you've been working. People kept doing this into the 1960s, but these days they've mostly been replaced by specialist hop picking machines.
Chapter 2. Breweries.
This is the Anchor pub on the South Bank. There's been a pub here for over 800 years, although it's had a few name changes and it's been rebuilt a few times. Some people will even tell you that William Shakespeare used to come here for a drink after a performance at the Globe Theatre. And it is pretty close to the Globe, although there's no evidence that Shakespeare ever actually drank there. Someone who did drink here was Samuel Pepys. During the Great Fire in 1666, he says he came down onto Bankside, he found a little alehouse, and there watched the fire grow. Someone else who drank here was a chap called Samuel Johnson. Yeah, the meme guy. He's most famous for his Dictionary of the English Language, which he wrote in 1755, and it took him 8 years to put it all together. I wouldn't normally recommend reading a dictionary for fun, but his does have some fairly funny definitions in it. He calls lunch as much food as one's hand can hold, a politician, a man of artifice, and a ruse, a French word neither elegant nor necessary. In the 17th century, he was friends with the brewery owners, and they let him use one of the rooms as an office. And when he wanted a break, he'd come and drink in the pub proper. And someone else who's drunk here at the Anchor is Tom Cruise in the film Mission Impossible. The pub is named the Anchor after the Anchor Brewery, and the brewery in the 19th century was the largest brewery in the world. And you could take a tour around the brewery, and then you'd finish up in the official gift shop, if you like. The brewery was shut down and demolished in 1981, but the pub is still there. So in 1780, there was this anti-Catholic riot called the Gordon Riot, and it was thought at the time that the brewery's owner, Henry Thrale, was a Catholic sympathiser. So the mob came for him, and his manager, John Perkins, had to hold off the mob by buying them all drinks. By the 1830s, the brewery was a visitor attraction in its own right, and one of the people who visited was this Austrian ex-commander called General Haynau. Now, General Haynau obviously had a bit of a sense of humour about himself, otherwise why would you get this portrait painted? But he was also known as a bit of a brutal dictator, particularly for having women flogged for being suspected of sympathising with his enemies. So when he came on his tour of the brewery, the workers decided to give him a taste of his own medicine, and they made a whip and they chased him down the street with it, and this Austrian general was forced to hide in a bin until they went past.
Chapter 3. Taverns.
This is the George, built in 1677. It is the only pub left to have these kinds of features, but originally they would have been really common, these sorts of galleries, in a kind of pub called a coaching inn. So you'd drive your coach into the courtyard in the middle, and there'd be a groom there to take your horse and park your carriage, and you could get food and accommodation for the night. And if you can't afford a coach, you can also pick up one of the public stagecoaches here. And from there you could catch a coach to Brighton or Hastings or Canterbury or Dover. And in the evening, all the coachmen would gather there, and they would smoke their long clay pipes, and they'd drink tankards of beer, and they'd discuss the road behind and the road ahead. In the 16th century, travelling troupes of actors would put on plays in theatres like this. And you can see how it worked in this photo of A Tale of Two Cities. Basically, the galleries act as tiered seating. Around the 16th century, laws are starting to be put into place to combat vagrants, people moving from one town to the other. And those laws are broad enough to include travelling actors. So if you want to carry on acting, you have to get a licence, which means you've got to attach yourself to a person who's rich enough to buy the licence for you. So troupes of actors start attaching themselves to aristocrats, and so you'll find troupes of actors called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, or Lord Strange's Men, or even the Queen's Men. William Shakespeare himself would have played and worked in troupes like this, and he would have put on his plays in theatres like this. However, there is a bit of a problem with this kind of theatre space. First off, you can't charge for entry because it's not your space, so you're reliant on passing the cap round after a performance and hoping that the audience are generous. Secondly, you don't have any control over who's coming in and out. So imagine you're Horatio at the end of Hamlet, and you've just done "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest," and you lay Hamlet down, and it's a very solemn moment. And then some waitress bursts in with the 16th century equivalent of "Who ordered the teriyaki burger?" Completely ruins the moment. Also, because you're travelling from place to place, you've got to carry all your stuff. So you don't have anywhere to put big set pieces or a lot of costumes. You've got to get by on relatively little. Later, actors start settling down into permanent theatres, and that means that they can start building much bigger sets and having much fancier costumes.
Dickens has always been associated with the George. The pub is mentioned in Little Dorrit. Edward Dorrit writes a letter here to a chap called Arthur Clenham asking for money. The Dorrit's father has been in Marshalsea for debt for 20 years, and his children live with him in the prison. Marshalsea Prison was just around the corner between New Common Street and Mermaid Court. It started out as a state prison, like the Tower of London, but it was deeply unpopular. It was attacked in the Peasants' Revolt and in Cade's Rebellion, and in 1753 John Wesley visited and said, "Oh, shame to man that there should be such a place. Such a picture of hell on earth." In 1824, Charles Dickens's own father is imprisoned in Marshalsea for debt, and little Charles has to go and work in a blacking factory. He said he cried very much the first time he visited. His father told him that if a man had £20 a year and spent £19, 19 shillings and sixpence, he would be happy. But a shilling spent the other way would make him wretched. And in David Copperfield, Dickens's character Mr. Micawber gives the same advice. After it closed, Dickens said, "It is gone now, and the world is none the worse without it." But you can still see a little bit of the wall in Angel Place. Chapter 4. Movies.
Now, I've shown you 2 Southwark pubs already, but there are a couple that you'll probably already have heard of, and they're both in Borough Market. The first is the Globe in Borough Market, which you might think you've not have heard of, but someone very famous lives in the flat above the Globe, and that is Bridget Jones. So that area was used for filming in all 3 of the movies, and in fact Bedale Street is where Hugh Grant and Colin Firth have a fist fight in a restaurant in the first movie. It also features in another movie, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and the night bus screeches down Stony Street and comes to a stop outside the Leaky Cauldron.
Take her away,
Yeah, take it away.
So that's a Southwark pub too.
So there's your whirlwind tour through beer in Southwark, from the hops coming in Kent to the breweries to the taverns to modern movies. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.